I've been in post as UN Special Rapporteur for a little over a year, although it feels like a lifetime, and it's definitely been maybe really momentous time to both understand the gravity of climate change, what the science is indicating to us, but equally to see, I think, an incredible moment of legal clarity and truth about where maybe we have gone wrong in our climate diplomacy and action so far, but even more importantly, where and how quickly we can reset our course and really be able to prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change from happening. It is an honor and a daunting task to be in my role. On a day-to-day basis, I hear lived experiences of people who are most directly impacted by climate change, and this includes children, women, expecting mothers, elderly women, environmental human rights defenders, indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers and farmers, and also people who live in poverty or other marginalized situations in communities. Until a few years ago, this might have been the case only for certain regions in the world, and indeed we really have to be as aware as possible of the catastrophic impacts that have already occurred in the South Pacific, in the Caribbean, in certain areas of Africa or Latin America and Asia. In some countries, we have experienced over 10 years of catastrophic climate impacts to a point where governments are no longer able to adapt and respond and need even more urgently international cooperation. But for some of the countries that are represented at this table, the last 2 years have also shown how climate change is happening here and now. And I think it is important, not in a pessimistic way, but in a way that supports empathy and responsibility, that no one should feel safe. And maybe there's, beyond the cases that may be present in the media, we should look at health evidence. All of our bodies are changing because of climate change. It's really interesting to look at, for instance, how salinity in our body is changing because of sea level rise. Because of sea level rise, we have more seawater intrusion into our freshwater resources. And that changes the physiology of our bodies. And for instance, expecting mothers have a higher chance of negative birth outcomes. This is just an example to show how subtle those relationships today's human well-being and climate change are, even in regions and places and cities where we are more protected or less expecting immediate negative impacts of climate change. But as I said, we know what the solutions are, and I think my role has been both to try and bring together how the experiences of those most affected by climate change give us the most important indications about how best to respond, which mitigation measures to prioritize, but also what measures in terms of adaptation and also responses to loss and damages can be put in place. We often feel that climate change is a very technical issue, and of course we need to rely on climate science, global modeling, but we also need to understand how in our daily lives we see where our measures related to climate change are not working, how we're being affected, who's being affected most, and that needs to be a lead for our responses. So it's important that in a way any conversation on climate change and decision-making on climate change is not restricted to climate experts, to climate scientists, to politicians, but where we make space for all of us to hear those lived experiences and through those experiences understand where so far we have maybe fallen short. And that's because climate change is very much not only bringing new negative impacts on human rights, but also magnifying negative impacts on those whose human rights are already least protected. And again, I'm thinking about children, girls and women, persons with disabilities, and only those persons who experience multiple grounds of vulnerability and sometimes of discrimination know what we can do to prevent that. And this is why it is so important for them to be at the table and to be recognized as equal climate experts as others who maybe have that role recognized. The other aspect that's really important, I was mentioning about legal truth and scientific truth. I mean, since last year, we know how, as a whole, the international community is falling short quantitatively and qualitatively in putting in place and even planning ahead measures to respond to climate change. All UN bodies have indicated how our plans up to 2030 are falling short of what we need to remain within a 1.5 degree scenario. And already at the beginning of this year, we had scientific evidence showing that we have crossed for the first time that limit. This is not a permanent crossing, and of course it's a crossing that needs to be assessed over a longer period of time, but it's certainly an essential alarm bell. What we have in place at the moment is not enough. Now, why is that the case? There are different reasons, and all of them are important for us to understand how we change the course. I think one fact that has only become more public in the very recent times is that fossil fuel companies and some of the historically fossil fuel producing countries have known for decades that fossil fuel use would lead to climate change. But they have kept the information away from us, away from the public. And in fact, some fossil fuel companies, and this is now very well documented, including through independent research, they continue to employ what's been defined a playbook of climate disinformation and climate obstruction. Now, this is the same playbook that tobacco companies have been using. We're very familiar with the strategies, but those strategies are becoming more and more aggressive and more difficult to combat. But we are in a situation where we have decades to catch up and undo the work that has been done in terms of keeping the public away from understanding that fossil fuels are the main cause of climate change, that phasing out fossil fuels is the priority action for us to prevent catastrophic climate change impacts, and that those companies are now present in staggering numbers as lobbyists in all our decision-making spaces. This is the case of the climate COP, but news from a few weeks ago, this is also the case, for instance, of the UN plastic pollution treaty negotiations, and it's the case of many regional, national, and even local decision-making processes. And so far, there's very little response in terms of addressing what is an irreconcilable conflict of interest. I think there's been efforts over the last 3 decades to try and work with fossil fuel companies to try and find solutions, but I think the evidence has now been lined up that they are not trustworthy partners, and they had an opportunities for decades to change their own course, to contribute in good faith to advancing climate action, but not only they have not done so, but they continue to impede progress. They attack climate scientists. They contribute to sometimes lethal attacks to climate and human rights defenders. And they have created a whole global ecosystem of disinformation, which has now really climbed to the top of international climate diplomacy. We've seen initiatives from the UN Secretary General on climate information integrity, and similarly from the Brazilian COP presidency. But this is a huge challenge because we will not be able to have meaningful, difficult, but important conversation with all sectors in society who can be negatively impacted by the phase out of fossil fuels, and I'm thinking particularly about workers, and any other citizen who is dependent on fossil fuels, and again, who has benefited for decades from fossil fuel subsidies, who are mainly consumption-based subsidies, and have kept fossil fuel prices at artificially low levels. So again, affecting our perception of what will be more economic, safer, both from a health perspective and a security perspective, sources of not only energy, but other support for our economic development. The second aspect that has kept us away from more meaningful progress in terms of climate action and protection of human rights is that we have had significant developments of climate law at the international level, which have then impacted climate laws at the local, national level and local level, who have been happening in isolation from other relevant areas of international law. And we have all shared in the expectation that that would help us keep a very focused view on how to solve the problem. Unfortunately, what this has revealed itself is what now we call a carbon tunnel vision. Focusing on carbon has not helped us to think about the climate problem as a problem of protecting our life-supporting systems. So this very narrow technical approach that has really shaped our international climate diplomacy has kept us away from other areas of science and other areas of legal and policy progress that could have given us a better sense of how we needed to think about climate action that's also ocean action, that's also nature action, and it's very much thinking about human rights impact not as maybe necessary sacrifices that somebody needs to pay for us to progress, but instead alarm bells that if we are providing climate solutions that are negatively impacting human rights of some individuals and some groups, that's an indication that we are deserving everyone's human right to a healthy environment and a safe climate, because of all the interconnections between the climate system and all the other systems that make life possible on this planet. And so for a long time, for instance, the climate diplomacy is kept separate from solutions at the climate-nature nexus, thinking more about protected areas, protecting the ocean, not as a separate environmental activity, and in fact a minor, potentially a nice to have, but an essential component of our climate solutions. And equally being very concerned and in fact deprioritizing any climate solutions that negatively impact on nature, on the water cycle, on the natural contributions that healthy ecosystem provide to climate regulation. And we see still some of this legacy, for instance, in some of the renewable resources we're prioritizing. We have significant evidence that, for instance, large-scale hydropower can be so damaging to nature, in fact, even emitting, if we take the full life cycle of construction, of clearing of forest, of methane emissions from certain reservoirs, that they may actually not be helping on climate mitigation and creating massive human rights issues, which we are, I think, by this stage very well aware of. So all this may be quite disheartening. I have many colleagues who have worked in the climate system at many levels for many years. And of course, we don't want to undermine all that work and that knowledge, but we need very quickly to create a much more inclusive space for decision making, where we listen and respond to those elements of science that have been kept at a distance in climate decision making, where we listen to nature, to biodiversity scientists much more than we have in the past, where we listen to health scientists much more than we have in the past, and we realize that climate solutions need to be co-developed across those knowledge systems and the lived experiences of those who have been most affected, because in their lives all these systems come together into a very specific reality. Very recently, in the last few months, we've had two advisory opinions from the International Court of Justice and from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that have confirmed that state obligations on climate change also need to be respectful and support international obligations relating to nature, relating to the ocean, and very much taking everything we have learned around how climate change itself and some climate measures have negatively impacted human rights as the core evidence base to prevent, not only prevent any foreseeable negative impacts, further negative impacts of the climate solutions that are not very effective, but really to rethink climate action as the action that needs to prevent any further harm to the life-supporting systems on our planet. And that's the task. But I think what is terrifyingly beautiful in those advisory opinions, which in some way show that we weren't on the right course, is that we have the science and we have now legal clarity about the path we need to take. The priority actions that need to be receiving the most funding, that need to be focus of international cooperation, that needs to be the number one issue to be discussed at every level in the most inclusive fora we can create. And every form of dialogue, this I've realized in my work as well, every conversation I have, every relationship we build around this core of truth, which we have, with hard work of over decades of activists, young people, experts, this is what we have to hold on, and each in our own capacities, researchers, advocates, policymakers, we can all play our role now in making sure that we stick to those priorities and that we move away from other I think, solutions which are increasingly, I think, revealing themselves as false solutions or not sufficiently able to protect all that interconnected forms of life that make the climate system, that make all the other systems move away from any more sectoral solution that doesn't take into account the evidence. And in my own work, I think the emphasis I played this year on phasing out fossil fuels is clearly the priority, is very much a difficult one, but one that we know could make the difference and could make the difference in the next 5 years. And again, it's important to look at that phasing out of fossil fuels not purely as a matter of energy transition. It is, of course, and again, we have plenty of knowledge and we have now evidence of how renewables are ready technologically. They're already cheaper, they're already more able to reach, for instance, in areas where we're still experiencing energy poverty than fossil fuels has ever been, and they have not delivered over decades on that reduction of energy poverty. But they also affect many other areas of our lives. I've relied a lot in my report, again, on health evidence, medical evidence, to see how beyond the contributions to climate change, fossil fuels, from the moment of extraction to transport, to use, to waste management, they negatively affect our human health in ways that affect every single organ in our body, and they're all preventable. They very often happen to communities who live near fossil fuel plants and extractions, but they also affect people worldwide. Fossil fuel-related air pollution is one of the, if not the biggest, killer of children and many other vulnerable individuals. So what the health community is advocating, and I have very much taken that on board, is phasing out fossil fuels is also the most impactful health intervention we could ever make. So it's the most impactful climate intervention, it's the most impactful health intervention we could ever make, and it has, of course, also significant contributions for nature and for our right to food and water. And that's what my next report will be, really looking at food systems, both on land and in the ocean, and see how that continued expansion of fossil fuel use which we are facing, because that is the reality. While we knew for a while the fossil fuel phase-out is one of the climate action, fossil fuel extraction is expanding everywhere in the world. And how are they doing this? Well, they're moving slightly away from the energy sector, and they're expanding in other sectors. They're expanding in terms of production of plastics, which we use in many other sectors, but which we know is choking our planet. It's also contributing to more climate change, to more health impacts, and to more violations of human rights. They're also expanding in terms of petrochemicals products, and this is what we have in our food systems. So much so that those substances, in many cases, include a term that I never come across before, new elements. I'm like, what is this new elements? Is new synthetic chemical substances for which we don't even have a name for, let alone are able to regulate. But they're all mixed in this expansion of petrochemicals, which is to favoring fossil fuel extraction, but which creates yet another level of climate harm, yet another level of human rights violations. So it's a system that kind of requires us to think about phasing out fossil fuels within, but also beyond the energy sector. And once again, thinking, where are we headed with this fossil fuel-based economic model? Are we really jeopardizing our food sources, our water sources, all human and natural system that allows us also to be resilient to climate change for the benefit of a powerful but relatively limited economic sector? And what about all the other economic sectors who are already being undermined by climate change and by this expansion of fossil fuels? So what I would like to maybe conclude, and I'm looking forward to then opening the debate, is these are hard truths. They're not truths that we weren't familiar with, but we have somehow not been able to have them central and prioritized in our climate action, partly because of a very effective action in many ways by fossil fuel companies and producing countries, but also some, of course, consumer countries. But this is the challenge, and it's a challenge that is intersectoral, but also it's a challenge that is intergenerational. We already have evidence of how fossil fuels are affecting children on their way to coming to this planet. We can already predict certain negative impacts decades ahead, but we have the solutions. And maybe this is the best point in time in the whole of history to be able to, for some to transition to a renewable-based economy, for some countries to leapfrog directly to that kind of economy, as long as we are clear on the priorities and very transparent and inclusive about the processes that can lead us there, while taking into account all potential negative impacts on human rights holders, and particularly the ones who have already been most impacted by climate change and who are crucial experts to support us along this path. Thank you.
Professor Morgera, thank you very much indeed. You kindly said in your closing remarks that you're happy to open the discussion. We're grateful. I know you have about 15 minutes left until you have to leave. I'm happy to open the floor to discussion, comments, or even questions for Hans and then Anne.
I'll bring you the microphone for the recording.
This one here. There we are. We have a couple. There we are.
Just move the one in the middle.
Yeah.
For the next one.
Just very briefly, I followed with great interest your presentation. Our organization later this month will convene a roundtable consultation in Malta on the topic Maritime Order in the Global Era, with the subtitle National Interest versus the Common Good of Humanity. And we have experts not only of maritime law, we cooperate with the International Maritime Organization and its research institutes, but also of environmental studies and law. And we will publish the papers, and we'll also print a book and distribute our recommendations. So if a contact could be established with your office, it would be very welcome on our part.
Thank you. And I would like also to congratulate Malta has been leading in the Human Rights Council together with the Dominican Republic, a new resolution that the Human Rights Council will consider in the next few weeks on the human rights implications of sea level rise. And of course, we had an international law commission report recently, but it's really important to keep.
There will be special papers also in our meeting on this problem of sea level rise, the issue of climate refugees as it is called.
Well, we can be sure to put you in contact. Thank you, Hans. Anne.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I have two questions and one comment. The question is the question of ecocide. What is the status legally of ecocide now? And is there a possibility, you think, to hold especially companies accountable for ecocide? And the second question is, in many countries, including my own, there is now a backlash when it comes to climate issues and, all this that came with Greta Thunberg, who is on her way to Gaza, by the way, because the climate, part of the climate movement has moved to be instead active when it comes to the Gaza situation. Do you feel the backlash also in your work? And then the comment, OSCE with the 57 member countries. I was chair of OSCE in 21. Now Finland is chair, and I don't know the name of the foreign minister, unfortunately, but here, Elina Valtonen. so it says something. So she's chair now. In 2021, we managed to agree by all the 57 countries to give a mandate to OSCE to work with climate and security, which has not been allowed before. When organizations like OSCE are getting this formal mandate, do they use it? And can you use it to help your work?
Thank you so much. Great questions and comment. So on ecocide, at the moment there is a proposal that has been led by Vanuatu but also other states to create a new international crime of ecocide. I'm not privy to whether that's going to go ahead or not, but I think it is an important indication of how we are seeking a recognition, which is still, with I think that the recent advisory opinion have contributed to, about the gravity and severity and preventability of further climate harm. And so that recognition of, the in a way, the mark of criminal law, both internationally and nationally, is really crucial, both in terms of the symbolism of it, potentially the deterrent effect, hopefully, but also engaging systems in international law that have their specific enforcement procedures. There's also other efforts to use existing international crimes to address some forms of climate inaction or harm to the climate system. These are all ongoing conversational work, I think, within academia across different countries, but also the prosecutor, the International Criminal Court. So these are all, I think, processes. There's an element of connecting the evidence as well to meet the higher standards that criminal law requires. But I think that is in motion, and I think we might see that some clarifications around international criminal law and climate change very soon. On backlash, yes, I have met them in my mandate, mainly in terms of the concerns of the governments I work with in Geneva and elsewhere, and of course civil society wondering, well, how can we give follow-up to your recommendations in the current political context? There's no easy answers to that, but I have maybe three reflections to offer. The first is, in some ways, the current backlash might be considered the ultimate result of decades of climate disinformation and obstruction, all the way to a point where we might see some of our very, undemocratic institutions being a victim of that approach. That said, progress on phasing out fossil fuels and any other meaningful climate action at any level is important, and I have recommended really looking at any areas where even, within a state, there may be a city, there may be a subnational entity, there may be a football club who are willing to, forge a path ahead. And all of those initiatives are meaningful and can create an important momentum. And critically, the learning from those initiatives need to be brought at higher levels, at the national level of international, and inspire further change. We shouldn't be deterred by that pushback to think that no action is possible or that we need nation-state-driven action. We can see meaningful action at any level, and we need to think how we can support that from expanding across levels. And the third is how important is protecting the rule of law is in this context, and particularly the role of the judiciary and the protection of the independence of the judiciary. But of course, the role of any other public actor and any other democratic process. I'm thinking about any planning decision is a decision that can help us towards the right path or can set us back or keep us in the wrong course. And so really thinking again about each and every individual's role in upholding those democratic processes, in making sure they are as inclusive and as based on available science and respectful of those democratic guarantees that we need to protect, maybe now more than ever. The third point was...
OSCE and
yes.
mandate to work with climate and security.
Yeah, so the framing of climate as a security issue is actually quite a tricky one. And even at the UN level, we haven't necessarily been able to progress. Now, for sure, climate change is a security issue, maximizes risks for security, and also meaningful climate solutions, including the phase out of fossil fuels, can contribute so importantly to peace and to security. And this may be one element as well that can be really important in terms of democratic processes, really more clearly showing how militarization and armed conflicts are increasing climate change in ways that we're not even monitoring, because military emissions are not monitored under the climate regime, how funding militarization is taking away public funding from climate action. And again, there are many other connections between the conflict industry and the fossil fuel industry, for instance. But I guess what happens with the securitization framing is that often that is not quite supportive of engaging with human rights and inclusive conversation. And that's maybe silos that needs to be broken. That for meaningful work towards peace and understanding that connection between climate and security, once again, we need human rights holders who have been most affected at the table, telling us how in their daily lives they see where meaningful climate action can lead to more peaceful situations, and where instead maybe some of the trends we're witnessing are contributing to more risks for our security. So again, not thinking, maybe limiting those fora to security experts and climate experts, because there are other holders of knowledge that maybe can help us have more generative conversations there.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes.
Taking that on a little bit further, just thinking about procurement policy across the global economy. Is that something that can be looked at? Are you looking into that? So taking it further than just another three, and that it's how do we create a globally responsible economy, and how does that fit in with environmental and climate change? And is it something that you're researching into, or is there some work being done in that area?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I haven't myself done work there, but I think there's lots of potential. There's been kind of broader conversations around investment and disinvestment, and of course, procurement is a way to both invest, but also to give signal to different economic operators about how our production systems need to shift, how our choices in terms of use of materials and impacts on the climate system can change. So I think it is necessary to include procurement among all the toolkit that's available to public authorities, again, at every level, to make sure we see that shift away from fossil fuels and all fossil fuel dependent activities and actors, and shift towards renewables and renewable based and nature protection that all support more meaningful and effective climate action.
Please.
Thank you, and thank you for your speech. I first wanted to ask about the effect of the wars towards the climate change, but you already evaluated that a bit. Another question in my mind is related what is happening in US and how the Trump is actually attacking also the research and information that we have about the climate change, and the speech about destroying the NASA satellites. I don't know if that is on your table or if you know anything about it, because I had in my mind this kind of a thought that Trump is willing to make many kind of deals. Is there any other, like EU or other research institute who could actually buy those satellites, or how can we have the information and the research and the knowledge that we need in future if there are such attacks towards it? And if you can analyze a bit what is happening in US in the climate change matters.
Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you so much. And I think that there's actually an underlying point in your comment which speaks also to securitization, which is our human right to information and our human right to science are crucial for that move towards meaningful solutions, and all of us being able to protect ourselves in the context of climate change and being able to assess whether or not our governments at every level are doing the best that they can to protect us from the negative impacts of climate change. And interestingly, the Inter-American Court has relied quite extensively on the report I wrote last year on access to information on climate change and human rights. So the fact that the Trump administration has already dismantled so many significant systems of information on climate change is not only a violation of their own citizens, and there have already been instances where, for instance, the farmers associations in the US have, have taken the government to court because they have no longer access to information to make day-to-day decisions to protect food systems in the US. Of course, because of the US role in international scientific cooperation, so many other countries are negatively affected by that destruction of databases, the availability of that information, and now, even thinking all the way to satellite structures to continue and further develop that information base and significantly the base for that scientific cooperation around the world. I think what gives me hope is that no state is a monolith. We have different powers. Of course, a state like the US is a state made of states, and many states in the US have very different policies and are taking their own initiatives within constitutional limits to do differently. And we also have researchers who are themselves taking it, different universities and coalition of scientists across the world trying to save the information, create alternative spaces for the information to be stored securely and made available. And I guess in the context in which we are, where we're seeing such significant attacks to democracy, including sometimes within our democratic structures, there's a point about thinking about more almost resistance-based thinking that we need to put in place for any state and public authority and anyone with power, including finance, really thinking about how you can work in partnership with those human rights defenders out there, wherever they are, who are counteracting and taking concrete action to protect our human right to information and to science in this context. So we might need to be more creative in thinking about these alliances, but it is essential this very minute. The other thing is, again, there's been so many judicial action being brought against the Trump administration. We'll have to see what the decisions are. But again, there's also been a lot of, my colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur on Independence of Judges, has already issued several statements about how the judiciary in the US is being threatened, their independence is being attacked, they've been harassed. So that's another layer of protection that we need to ensure everyone in power to contribute. But also, again, alerting the public that this is happening and really thinking about all the defenses we need to put in place for those decisions that are harming our human rights. And unfortunately, they are very much having an impact across the globe as well as on the US own population. So it's important to map, to look at what movements are reacting to it, and then think about how we can support internationally, also in terms of bilateral cooperation from the academic to the political to the any other level, because that is our common concern, to make sure that information and the scientific cooperation based on it continues.
Thank you. One question from the last question from Heba, and then I have, if I may use my role as chair, to ask you one final question.
Very quickly. You mentioned that you now know the mitigation measures. Can you share some of those with us?
Yes, well, phasing out fossil fuels is basically it. I mean, there's many phases to it, but that's really the main cause of climate change, and climate scientists have been indicated for a few years now that needs to be action that everyone needs to take. There are others. I mean, partly it has to do with my next report on food systems is also look at the role of the agricultural sector to climate change, and so that's also a very sizable contribution. I mean, to me, it's quite interesting how that large-scale, unsustainable agriculture is a fossil fuel-based model of agriculture. And so in a way, we're still looking at the same conglomerates and the same model of attack to our life-supporting systems in different sectors. But these are the two areas. Well, of course, we have several other aspects. I think energy efficiency is an area which I think most recent assessments from the UN energy organizations are showing we haven't made progress. And to me, that's going even one step underneath the climate crisis, and in fact, all the planetary crises we're facing, including economic inequalities crisis, and saying we are asking for too much energy for not necessarily globally beneficial purposes, in fact, still benefiting the very same 1% and 10% richest people who are also benefiting from the fossil fuel-based economy. And we're not actually asking how much do we really need to ensure well-being for all, and how can we do that technologically in ways that are least consuming of our available resources. And that's, again, it's a question about research priorities, funding priorities. I'm very concerned, for instance, about how much private finance is going into geoengineering a very risky, untested technology to try and fix the thermostat of the planet, let alone the security issues, the power issues there. But even on a science perspective alone, this can't be a priority, and this can be something that takes money away from energy efficiency, for instance. Because we know that that's going to get there for sure. It's going to be more protective, again, health, economic benefits for everyone's human rights, as opposed to still benefiting a very small minority that's got us into the planetary crisis we're facing. So,
thank you. And finally, if I may, you touched upon it briefly, but I'm very interested in the increasing disconnect between citizens of the world and their governments. A sense that the leaders are failing us and they're not representing the views of the people. So I wonder, in the term of your mandate so far, if you're able just to tell us which citizens in which part of the world are most active and most ahead in understanding of the situation where we are relative to climate change and the humanitarian crisis that stems from it, and which governments, which countries are doing well in that respect.
So I don't want to pick any favorites, but there's a few examples of how to do it that I think are really important. And to me, it's how do we create those meaningful spaces for dialogue, for states to take the right action. And there's a few stories I've heard that gave me a lot of hope, and we're going to actually look into them at an upcoming UN forum on democracy, rule of law, and climate change. So one example has been a recent Irish biodiversity citizen assembly. So it's not about climate, but it was in the end about climate. But what was interesting about that is that they had an adult citizen assembly and they had a children assembly. And the children process was very well supported by civil society. Arts was used, play, games were used. Basically, cutting a long story short, all the recommendations that the children agreed upon were then endorsed en bloc by the adult citizen assembly. And that just shows that something that, again, seems so impossible. Children, what do they know? How can we engage with them? But if we do it in the way that are based on children-centered methodologies, they're not only good for children and for us to listen to children, and we actually make us better adults with more empathic, imaginative thinking, more system thinking. And I think that's something that I've been advocating even before becoming rapporteur. But I think not only engaging children, but using children-centered methodologies is going to allow all of us as adults to use the full range of our cognitive skills, which are engaged by play, by art, to transcend some of the assumptions that have been, shaping climate action for the last 30 years, and allow us to land in a more imaginative space where we can focus on those priority actions and think more effectively about the path ahead.
Well, I think that's an exceptionally positive way in which to end your excellent talk to us, and also something that we can all take away. The Irish example, using children and then adults and enforcing that is a wonderful thing to look forward to. So again, please join me in thanking Professor Morgera. Thank you very much indeed.